Have you ever wondered what would happen if someone tried to test the discipline of the King's Guard? Well, today's story reveals an unforgettable moment at Buckingham Palace that left everyone in shock. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell because tomorrow we have another incredible story that you won't want to miss. Trust me, it's even more surprising than today's. He thought the royal guard would ignore him, but the guard's reaction terrified everyone. It was a bright, bustling afternoon in front of Buckingham Palace. The grand gates stood tall, polished to perfection, as tourists gathered to witness the iconic changing of the guard. Cameras clicked, voices murmured, and children pointed in excitement, eager to see the world-famous King's Guard in their crimson uniforms and tall bearskin hats. Among the crowd, a young boy named Ethan Parker, just 7 years old, stood with his mother, Rebecca. His hazel eyes sparkled with curiosity as he gazed up at the silent, immovable soldiers standing at their posts. To Ethan, these guards didn't seem real. They looked more like statues, unshakable, unblinking, completely still. It fascinated him. How could a person stand for so long without moving an inch? Didn't they get tired? Didn't their noses itch? The idea made him giggle. He tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, do they ever move?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. Rebecca smiled, adjusting her sunglasses. "They're trained to stand perfectly still. No matter what happens, they don't react." Ethan frowned, deep in thought. He wanted to test it for himself. His mother was busy flipping through her phone, checking her travel itinerary. His chance had arrived. Sneaking forward just a bit, he picked up a small handful of dust from the ground, letting it slip through his fingers. He looked back at the guard, watching him carefully. The soldier, tall and disciplined, stood like a statue, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His polished black boots gleamed under the sun. Ethan hesitated. Then, with a mischievous grin, he flicked the dust toward the guard's feet. The tiny specks landed softly on the soldier's pristine boots. A few tourists nearby gasped, noticing the boy's action. His mother, still unaware, remained focused on her phone. Ethan watched intently, waiting for any sign of movement. Nothing. Not a single flinch. The guard remained just as still as before. Encouraged, Ethan took a bold step forward. He gently kicked his foot against the dirt, sending a small cloud of dust toward the soldier's boots. More whispers spread through the crowd. Some people chuckled, while others frowned disapprovingly. But still, Ethan's confidence grew. Maybe he really is a statue, he thought to himself. He was about to try again when, suddenly, something changed. A shift so subtle that only the most observant would notice. The soldier tightened his grip on his rifle. It was the slightest movement, but it sent a chill down Ethan's spine. For the first time, he wondered, had he gone too far? Ethan's heart pounded as he stood frozen in place. Had the guard just moved? It was barely noticeable, just a slight tightening of his grip on his rifle, but Ethan felt it. The realization sent a nervous chill down his spine. Around him, the crowd murmured in hushed voices. Some had noticed the small movement, while others remained unaware, too focused on their cameras and sightseeing. His mother, still busy with her phone, hadn't seen a thing. But Ethan knew. The guard wasn't just a statue. He was watching. For a split second, the thrill of the prank started to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of uncertainty. He had heard stories about the King's Guard, how they never spoke, never moved unless absolutely necessary, how they were highly trained soldiers, not just ceremonial figures. But surely, they wouldn't do anything over a little dust, right? Ethan swallowed hard, but curiosity still burned inside him. He had come this far. He had to see if the guard would react again. He glanced around, making sure no one would stop him, and then lifted his foot, nudging the dirt with the tip of his sneaker, sending another small cloud of dust onto the guard's spotless boots. This time, the response was immediate. With a sudden, sharp movement, the guard stomped his boot against the ground, the crisp sound cracking through the air like a gunshot. The unexpected noise sent a shockwave through the crowd. People gasped, heads whipped around, and Ethan jumped back so fast he nearly tripped. His mother snapped her head up, startled. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Ethan couldn't answer. His face flushed hot, his stomach twisted. The soldier hadn't spoken, hadn't broken formation, but his reaction had been clear and deliberate, a silent warning. The weight of the moment hit him hard. This wasn't a game anymore. The guard had reacted, but he wasn't angry. He was simply reminding Ethan of something important: respect. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides, his heart hammering in his chest. He hadn't expected this. The tension in the air was thick, and for the first time, he felt the true authority of the king's guard. His mother's voice was sharp with concern. "Ethan, step away. Now." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He took a small step back, his eyes still locked on the towering figure in the red coat, standing as firm and disciplined as ever. But now, Ethan knew the truth. The guards were not just for show. They were watching, always ready, and they weren't to be messed with. Ethan's pulse raced in his ears as he took another step back, his mother's firm grip suddenly clamping onto his arm. "What were you thinking?" she whispered, her voice sharp but low, as if afraid to disturb the thick silence surrounding the guard. The crowd began to settle, but not without a few lingering stares in Ethan's direction. Some tourists chuckled awkwardly, shaking their heads as if relieved that it hadn't escalated further. Others kept their distance, glancing between Ethan and the guard as if expecting something more to happen. But nothing did. The guard stood as rigid as ever, his boots once again perfectly placed, his rifle firm in his grip. The only sign of his brief reaction was the last traces of dust settling around his feet, a stark contrast against the polished black leather of his boots. Ethan's throat was dry. He had pushed too far. He could feel it now. This wasn't just some amusement for tourists. The guards weren't performers. They were soldiers, trained to remain still until duty required otherwise. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, Ethan had crossed that line. His mother exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "We're leaving." But before she could pull him away, a firm, controlled voice cut through the air. "Young man!" Ethan's breath hitched. The words came directly from the guard. The crowd fell silent once more, all eyes snapping back toward them. A murmur of shock rippled through the tourists. The guards weren't supposed to speak, not unless absolutely necessary. Ethan turned back, his heart hammering in his chest. The guard was looking at him. Not fully, not with a break of posture, but the slight tilt of his head confirmed that the words had been meant for Ethan. "You will respect the king's guard." The sentence was simple, but the weight behind it felt heavier than anything Ethan had ever experienced. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a scolding. It was a command, a reminder of the discipline, tradition, and responsibility these soldiers upheld. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't even breathe properly. He nodded quickly, his lips pressing together, his hands suddenly feeling awkward at his sides. The guard said nothing more. He returned his gaze forward, locking back into place as if Ethan had never been there at all. But Ethan knew better. His mother pulled him away, her grip still tight, and as they walked, Ethan stole one last glance over his shoulder. The guard remained still, unshaken, unwavering. But Ethan felt it. A lesson he wouldn't forget. As Ethan and his mother walked away from the guard, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily in his chest. The tension in the air had been thick, pressing down on him like an unseen force. The way the guard had spoken, so controlled, so firm, had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He had expected a laugh, maybe a few amused glances from tourists, but instead, he had been met with a presence so unmovable, so absolute, that it made him feel small. The realization gnawed at him as they weaved through the crowd, his mother's grip still firm on his arm. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quiet but stern. She led him away from the gates, away from the tourists who had witnessed his foolish stunt. They stopped near a quiet bench under the shade of a towering tree. His mother finally released him, crossing her arms as she took a deep breath. "Do you have any idea how serious that was?" Ethan dropped his gaze, his fingers curling at his sides. "I thought it was just a game," he muttered, barely able to hear his own voice over the pounding in his ears. "A game?" His mother let out a sharp breath, rubbing her temples. "These aren't actors, Ethan. They're soldiers. They train for years. They dedicate their lives to protecting this place, to upholding their duty." She looked at him then, her expression softer but no less serious. and you disrespected that." Ethan swallowed hard. He had never really thought about it like that before. He had assumed they were there just for show, just part of the experience for tourists. But the way the guard had spoken to him, the way he had commanded respect, told a different story. His mother's voice softened. "I know you didn't mean harm, but you have to understand, these men aren't here for amusement. They're here because their job is important. And when you cross that line, even for just a second, you force that guard to break his discipline. That's not something they take lightly." Ethan's stomach twisted. He thought back to the guard's boots, still dusted with dirt from his careless actions. He thought about the sharpness in the man's voice, not angry, not cruel, but commanding. For the first time, he felt embarrassed. Not because he had been caught, not because he had been scolded, but because he had failed to see what was right in front of him. He exhaled slowly, nodding. "I get it," he murmured. His mother studied him for a moment before sighing. "I think you should go back." Ethan's head snapped up. "What?" She nodded toward the palace. "You need to make this right." His pulse quickened. Go back? Face the guard again? He wasn't sure he had the courage, but deep down he knew his mother was right. Ethan's heart pounded as he stood near the towering gates of Buckingham Palace once again. The crowd had shifted since earlier, new tourists filling the square, but the guard he had insulted still stood in the same place, unmoving, unwavering, unshaken. His mother gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You can do this," she whispered. He swallowed hard, nodding. This was his mess, and he had to fix it. Steeling himself, he took a deep breath and stepped forward, weaving through the throng of onlookers. The closer he got, the more his nerves threatened to take over. What if the guard ignored him? Worse, what if he had already been reported? Stopping just outside the invisible boundary, Ethan hesitated before clearing his throat. "Sir," he said, voice barely above a whisper. The guard didn't flinch. Ethan took a breath and tried again, louder this time. "Sir, I wanted to apologize." The words hung in the air. Nothing. The guard remained as still as a statue, his gaze fixed straight ahead. A lump formed in Ethan's throat. He had hoped for some kind of reaction, but maybe that was foolish. These men weren't trained to entertain. They weren't here to talk. Still, he refused to walk away. "I shouldn't have done that," he continued, forcing himself to speak despite the heat rising in his cheeks. "I didn't understand before, but I do now. I disrespected you, your job, and everything you stand for. I know you probably can't respond, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry." For a long moment, the world felt silent. The sounds of the city blurred into a distant hum. Then, just as Ethan was about to turn away, something unexpected happened. The guard moved. It was barely a shift, a simple, calculated motion, but it sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. The man adjusted his grip on his rifle, his fingers tightening just slightly. Then, in a movement so subtle it could have been missed, his eyes flickered downward. Just for a second. Ethan sucked in a breath. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but in that moment, he knew. The guard had heard him. He didn't need words to understand the message. A lesson had been learned, a line had been drawn, and respect, true, unspoken respect, had been given. Ethan stepped back, nodding once before turning to leave. This time, he didn't run. As he reached his mother, she smiled. "Proud of you," she said softly. Ethan exhaled, glancing back at the palace one last time. He would never look at the royal guards the same way again. Have you ever had a moment where you misjudged someone, only to later realize the weight of your mistake? That's exactly what happened to Ethan at Buckingham Palace. What started as a simple act of curiosity turned into a lesson in respect, discipline, and humility. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where you had to learn respect the hard way? Maybe you misjudged a situation, underestimated someone, or had an encounter that changed your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments. And tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing how far our stories reach, whether you're in the US, Europe, Asia, or anywhere around the world. Let us know in the comments below. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's incredible story. We have another thrilling tale lined up, and trust us, you won't want to miss it. Turn on notifications so you're the first to know when it drops.